So let's all, I think the speakers, let them introduce themselves. And just, Stacey, do you want to begin first?
Sure. Yeah. Hi. Thank you, Asima. And everyone, thank you for joining us. We're so excited to be having a great conversation today. My name is Stacey Harris. I'm the Chief Research Officer for Sapient Insights Group and the lead researcher for the Sierra-Cedar Annual System Survey that many of you probably know now in its 23rd annual year. Quick comment before we get started with introductions for everyone. If you do have questions, please be sure to put them in your question and Q&A box or in the chat box. We'll make sure that we try and answer them throughout, or we are going to try and save some time at the end of the presentation afterwards. And just because I know it's always a question, we will be sending out the deck after the presentation. And there will be a recording of the presentation as well. So just to forego a couple of the upfront questions. I'm going to introduce also our great panel today. We have some wonderful people who will be having the conversation with me. Murali Sastry, can you do a little introduction of yourself and your role over at Skillsoft?
Sure. Hey, good afternoon to you all. I'm very excited to be here today. I'm the Senior Vice President of Engineering here at Skillsoft. Skillsoft, if some of you who are not familiar, is the industry leader in online learning for companies large and small for the past 20 years. My role here at Skillsoft as a VP of Engineering is to build and support our learning experience platforms. Recently, for the past 4 years, we're building Percipio, which is our intelligent learning platform. And some of the thoughts I shared today is coming from the experience of building this platform.
Yeah, we're looking forward to hearing a little bit about that. It's going to be exciting to kind of compare systems and development with what we're talking about, which is data-driven HR, which is a great topic, I think, particularly with what everybody's going through right now. Shrikant Pattathil, can you maybe introduce yourself a little bit and your role at Harbinger?
Sure. Thanks, Stacey. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with you, Murali and Seema, and also part of this conversation. So I'm president at Harbinger Systems, and basically at Harbinger, we provide product and data engineering services to software vendors and corporates, and specifically focused in HR and learning domains. We have been at Harbinger in business for about 30 years. I have spent about 20 years working with learning management system companies and corporations, helping them with their HR and data strategy. And we have seen many evolutions in the industry. Coming to this webinar, I think in my recent conversations with many of our customers, we have seen a lot of interest on the HR side when it comes to data and analytics. So I look forward to share some of my experiences and also hear from you and Murali in terms of what you're seeing in the market and how you are kind of adopting some of these things. So look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. No, I think your experience and your sort of history of seeing so many organizations and their changes they've gone through will be great for the conversation today. Seema, I know you're going to be sort of hosting for us today, but maybe just a quick introduction of yourself. And I know you'll be checking in for questions for everybody's too, but your role within the organization as well?
Definitely. I'm Seema Chaudhary. I am Chief Alliance Officer with Harbinger Systems. I build partnerships. I build our technology partnerships, and happy to host this webinar today. Looking forward to an exciting webinar, and let's begin. Thank you, Stacey.
No problem. All right. Well, as I said, a lot of the conversation is going to be about data-driven HR organizations, and it's a little bit near and dear to my heart because I have been studying HR and learning and development for the last 15 plus years of my career. And before that, I was an HR practitioner, just like many of you who are out in the audience today. But for the last 6 years, I've been running the annual HR Systems Survey white paper. And a lot of the data that we'll be sharing today will be from that research paper that we produce every year and share for the market as a whole in October of each year. We're right now in the middle of our current year's survey data gathering. So we'll be showing a little bit of preliminary data too. So everybody out there is going to get a little bit of extra data from this year's data set that we're getting ready to close down in just a few days. But if you're interested in getting the full white paper or making sure you're part of the group that gets next year's white papers that get sent out, you're more than welcome to download the annual white paper, and there's a link here in the PowerPoint, and I think they're going to be putting a link in the chat group as well if you need it. So we'll be sharing data from that today. But the bigger conversation really is to put context around the data. That's why we wanted to have the webinar today, is that a lot of organizations are talking about about data-driven in a very sort of, we should all be data-driven. Data-driven is an important concept, and that's true. But I think there's sort of right ways and wrong ways to go about being data-driven organizations, and there's ways that we've seen in our research that organizations have been able to really harness data to make differences in their organizations. And those who've been able to harness it start really with the beginning conversations of strategy and culture. What is it that we're trying to achieve as a data-driven organization, and for our organization's outcomes, both from a strategy perspective, where are we going, what's the business goals, what's the things we're trying to achieve, and what's the culture we want to create inside of our organizations, or what's the culture we already have in our organization, and how do those two things fit together with the approach we take to capturing data, reviewing data, and making decisions about data inside of our organization. The other piece that we see a lot of organizations forget about is that they start to capture a lot of data, they measure a lot of things, they have a lot of metrics and analysis, but they haven't spent a lot of the upfront time they need on data governance. And data governance tends to be the fundamental thing that if you do it well, then even just a little bit of data analysis can do really powerful things for your organization. But if you don't do it well, it oftentimes leads to confusion, or people who aren't really comfortable with that the data's, saying the things that it could be saying because the data is not clean or the data is not where they want it to be. And so we're going to be talking about all of these things as a starting point for what a data-driven organization is. And I just want to really, put a comment out there. One of the things that's really important is that data-driven as a concept is important, but in this particular time right now where we're all dealing with the pandemic challenges, we're all dealing with changes in how we have to think about work, working from home, distancing ourselves from professionals inside of our organizations, making sure that we're sort of thinking about data in a different way. This conversation is more important than it has ever been. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and later on in the presentation about how organizations are using their approach to data to actually not only survive what we've been through in the last several months, but really thrive and think about what their new organization might look like going forward. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But the first start of a conversation about data is to understand that data and our technology is tightly combined. We really can't talk about being a data-driven organization unless we also talk about the kind of technology that we're going to use to sort of capture that data, share that data, and give it out to the market as a whole. And one of the things that Shrikant, Murali, and Seema and I have had a lot of conversations about as we've been going through this process is that every system that HR organizations sort of have time in or invest in have a connection to this data-driven conversation. So this picture here is a picture of all the different applications that we review and assess in our annual HR systems survey and research. And as I noted, the center of that conversation starts with strategy, culture, and data governance, but the outer ring, starting there with administration in the red box, is really important to understand that payroll and HR help desks and time and labor tools, as well as talent management and BI and analytics tools, these are all elements that need to connect. They don't have to be on the same system we have found in our research, but they do have to have data that flows in and out of them to make the data really useful inside organizations, to make it something that you can take action on. And outside of that, you also have to think about how it fits inside the bigger organization conversation, such as things like data privacy, our network security, our mobile strategies, and ultimately it has to connect to your other data environments like your finance systems, your customer relationship systems, even things like your workforce productivity tools like email. I mean, one of the things you're going to find out today is how email has become absolutely critical inside organizations and what it has done during the COVID-19 crisis management model for a lot of organizations. So when we talk about data, we're not just talking about the data that sits inside of one system like a core HRMS or an LMS. We're talking about data that sits in all of these systems. And this picture looks a little bit like a box within a box within a box, specifically because we know as we've been talking to organizations, these kind of processes aren't very linear. They're very much projects and processes on top of each other, and the process of data flow fits within that. And so we're going to be talking a lot about that today. Now, one of the things that we've seen in our research is that even though a lot of those applications that I just shared in that picture have been around for a long time, we've seen on average, the organizations will have a payroll or core HRMS application for 9 to 12 years sometimes in their organization. We know that the talent talent management systems and learning management systems have generally been found to have lower satisfaction ratings, particularly in the most recent survey analysis that we've been doing. And on average, we're seeing about 30% of organizations planning to replace their talent management systems over the next 12 to 24 months, and their learning management systems, somewhere in that 30% range. And that blew me away when I first started looking at data, because most organizations have only had a talent management or a learning management system in place for around 5 to 6 years, much fewer years than what we've seen with some of those other technologies. Now, some of it could be it's just easier to replace something that's not tied to your core, but actually when we started digging into what is it that organizations are struggling with, what is the challenge between these technologies versus some of the other technologies, there's really 4 things that kept coming over and over again in the feedback from our audience. Low adoption levels, poor reporting, poor data integration, and poor user experience. All of this is tightly connected to whether or not organizations can use all the investment of data and time they've put into these technologies to achieve something in their organization. And so what we're going to be talking a little bit about is how the technology and the data work together today and how organizations are achieving better outcomes with it. We've been following data-driven organizations for the last 5 years in our research. We've looked at it at both based off of, the fact that people want to be data-driven. We've looked at it from the behaviors organizations have actually put in place. And what we have found is that those organizations who have very specific behaviors that are what we would consider data-driven behaviors are much more likely to be viewed as strategic business partners, like the HR function or the learning function. It doesn't sort of matter where you're at, but if you're being more of a data-driven organization, then you're much more likely to see your HR and learning partners as strategic business partners. You're also much more likely to see that your HR technology, that big ring of tools that I was just talking about, right? That your HR technology is basically being used to inform business decisions inside your organization. Most organizations are using their HR technology to replace paper-based processes, like 80%, and most of them are using it to put data in and put data out, but they're not using it to inform business decisions. Data-driven organizations are. And the other thing that we've seen is that in those last 5 years that we've been doing the analysis is that over and over and over again, data-driven organizations have achieved better business outcomes than non-data-driven organizations. And we'll talk a little bit about what those business items look like. But I want to give a real, very specific definition of what is a data-driven organization. When we first started studying this 5 years ago, we didn't want to just ask people, are you data-driven? Because everybody thinks they're data-driven. Everybody sort of has an idea that, oh, I do a reports or I do some metrics. We wanted to actually look at behaviors. And the behaviors that we saw in our research showed that just about 15% of organizations actually have data-driven behaviors. And this is year over year for the last 5 years. That number really hasn't changed much. It's always been in that range of 15 to 16% of organizations. And the first thing that we saw with our research is that to be a data-driven organization, you really have to have at least effective or higher data governance processes that I talked about earlier, right? And on average, those data-driven organizations have, on a scale of 1 to 5, about a 3 of average level of process maturity for their data-driven organization being and their data governance processes. Non-data driven organizations are much more likely to be on that 1.67 level, which basically means they have maybe some processes or no processes at all around data governance, right? We also wanted to look at whether or not they gave frontline managers access to analytics, HR analytics specifically. And those organizations who are considered data-driven have to have at least 50% or more of their frontline managers having an HR analytics tool. And what we found is that if you're data-driven, you're much more likely to have more even data analytics put in front of your frontline manager. So that we saw that about, on average, they had 75% of their frontline managers having HR BI access. The other things that we looked at was what kind of data integration were you doing inside of your analytics tools. And what we found is that on average, we wanted to see at least 2 or more sources of data. Now that could be HR, could be business, it could be other tools. What we were looking for is that just sources of data were combined in an HR analytics tool. And on average, again, they outpaced that, most of the organizations who fell into that category. If they were doing 1 or 2, then they were definitely going to be doing on average about 4 or 5 different types of data sources that were being integrated compared to those who were non-data driven. And finally, the very last metric that we really wanted to look at was what metrics did they actually put in front of their senior executives. executives, what things were rolled up on a regular basis in HR reporting and business reporting that had an HR metric component to it, and was it more than one? And again, here, same thing. If you actually did more than one or two of these metrics within your executive reporting, we found that on average you did about 5 different metrics that were HR related that were rolling up into your executive reporting. So this is how we judge data-driven organization. It's a great little tool if you're kind of saying, am I data-driven? Can you check all these boxes off? Do you hit these average numbers in your organization at some level? And part of the reason why it's so important is that if only 15% of organizations are doing this and we're looking at them year over year, the real difference for us was, okay, can you then see the outcome in the impact that they're having on organizations? And so what we have seen 5 years in a row now is that these organizations over and over again, on a scale of 1 to 5, whether or not you have seen improvements in your ability to attract talent over the last 12 months, or improvements in your engagement scores, or improvements in your organization's ability to do an innovation or market share within the organization, we have seen that those kind of metrics have been much higher. They have been improved over the last 12 months if you are a data-driven organization, time and time again. And on average, that's somewhere in the range of 10 to 15% higher each year. That kind of business outcome and that kind of business impact isn't just a fluke after doing sort of a year or two of that kind of analysis. If it were just 1 year, I wouldn't, as a researcher, say this is something that's important to watch. But now that we've seen it 5 years in a row, going into our 6th year, and every year we see it happening over and over again with different data sets, the impact is really powerful, that those who have that focus and have that behaviors, they're getting something different. They're getting some better outcomes. And Shrikant and Murali, I'm going to ask you guys maybe to jump in here now in the conversation, because I've shared a lot of data about what data-driven organizations are and why they're important. But Shrikant, can you maybe start off with a little bit of insight into how you've seen organizations that you've worked with, either as clients or as organizations that you've had conversations with, use data to achieve outcomes inside their organization, similar to what we're seeing here on the chart?
Sure, Stacey. I think that was a good kind of analysis of how you are looking at it from what makes a data-driven organization. So one example that comes to my mind is we are helping a company build a product. It's a pre-hire product, helping in recruitment space, helping in the onboarding, helping in reference checking and so forth. And their promise to the end customer is, we will help you make the employee stay longer, right? And overall in the process automation, they're very successful, but they were not able to really tie that to outcomes together. So they built out surveys and analysis of exit interviews, and they try to correlate these things. And we help them build a solution which helps this in this correlation. But what very soon we found out was that data is not just specific to only these two systems, the exits and the onboarding or pre-hire. There is data in the learning systems, there's data in the goals, there's data in the intermediate surveys that happen that tell you the story of how long somebody is going to stay in the organization. So then, because we built a data warehouse sort of a solution, we were able to collect data from all these sources into the product and then report. And then the analytics became even better. They were able to better see an outcome of what the employee journey is going to be when they do a recruitment of a particular engineer. And now I think what they're even thinking of beyond this is how to go across organizations, how to collect data across organizations so that this becomes even more better. And they are able to predict, and the HR is able to intervene at the right time to make sure that the employee stays longer in the organization and helps the organization over.
I love that example. That hits on talent retention. It also hits on sort of decision data for helping sort of make decisions about employees inside the organization. It has a really great sort of insight into how organizations can take data and not just look at one data point, but multiple, as we talked about, right? So really good example from sort of on the ground and how organizations are doing it. Murali, I know that in Skillsoft, you guys focus a lot on data and how it can be used inside organizations. Do you have any examples of how organizations have achieved outcomes through the work that you guys have been doing with organizations?
Yeah, absolutely, Stacey. So you make some great points, right? So just to recap, you start with how culture having a strategy, and how to be data driven to achieve actual outcomes, right? So what we see here at Skillsoft is that some of our most successful customers really build a strong culture around data, right? They use data to drive specific outcomes, be it where they want to upskill a certain section of their workforce, or they're using data to actually measure the effectiveness of specific learning programs.
Mm.
So just to give an example, we had one of our big customers roll out this learning program where they were trying to improve their customer support, how their customer support organization performs. And within a span of a year, what they've seen is, the issues that they were addressing for the customers, on first contact, the fixed rate of it went from like 50% to 80%, and
Wow.
moreover, it decreased the customer support time from, let's say, spending 11 minutes to solve something to 6 minutes, right? So this is a great example, and the customer actually shared this story themselves in one of our meetings. They're also looking at not just looking at things like quality of service, but how do we employ faster onboarding of employees. What does it mean to take their organization to digital transformation, right? Another great example where I really love seeing is, a couple of our major customers taking their organization through agile training and transformation, and not just measuring based on how someone is completing these assignments, but actually really looking at their programs and products and services and how they're able to roll these things out faster to market.
Yeah, that's a great, I mean, that faster to market and that faster to onboarding, we don't think about how powerful that can be for an organization, especially with the kind of changes we're making. I mean, right now, many of us are changing our business models overnight, right? So that's critical. And then the idea that you can actually see business outcomes, like how quickly you can meet a customer's needs, right? All of those fit into this conversation we just had about impact, right? And, what I think both of you had mentioned was this idea of the different types of metrics those organizations were talking about, right? The things they were measuring that were different. And we often talk to a lot of organizations about sort of what kind of metrics are you really tracking? What are you putting in front of your business leaders on a regular basis? This is that HR reporting. And without a doubt, we see over and over again that it is the things that are easier to do, right? Turnover, demographics, a little bit of recruiting tends to be in there, right? And particularly turnover and demographics, those are very historical looking or backward looking metrics, right? Oftentimes it's after you've had a problem that you start looking, at your turnover metrics. What I think both of you had mentioned were metrics that were what we would consider more forward looking. And definitely data-driven organizations focus a lot more here. They put more attention in things like compensation. If I get that right up front, then people won't turn over as quickly, right? Absence and performance and learning. If I get learning appropriately put in place, then people feel comfortable with their job and they're much more likely to meet the objectives we need. Or Shrikant, as you had mentioned, making sure that I understand, where along the spectrum of hiring and onboarding that employee is getting engaged means that I'm going to ensure that they've got more productivity and how quickly they're meeting the needs of the organization, right? So these are the kind of conversations that we see data-driven leaders involved in. They're still doing turnover, they're still doing demographics, but they're definitely looking at other areas as an impact conversation. The other thing we see a lot of organizations spending time on, as we had mentioned, is not just what metrics we're looking at, and individual metrics are important, but you specifically both of you had mentioned the idea of integrating data, right? And Shrikant, you had a great example of how that integrating of the data gave you two different looks at an organization's outcomes, right? And what we find is that a lot of people will think about integrating only in the sense of their HR conversation. So payroll information with my core HRMS, my time and attendance with my, employee data about what they can work and what they can't work, and particularly what we would consider data-driven organizations spend a lot of time integrating core HRMS and workforce management. And usually they stop with 1 to 2 integrations inside their organization. A data-driven organization on average is integrating somewhere in the range of 4 to 6 different systems inside their organization. And one of the ones where they spend an inordinate amount of time from our research is talent and learning, making sure talent and learning is integrated with other things inside the organization, financials, as you guys had mentioned, operations, CRMs. What's really important there is, we showed that 30% of organizations who are planning to look at replacing their talent and learning solutions. And a lot of times when we get to the heart of what their challenges are, that the data is interesting. We've gathered data on skills, or we've gathered data on what people are doing at a performance management level, but we haven't connected that to business data, or we haven't connected that to our payroll data. And we don't really know what it means at the frontline levels. And that's what we're starting to see with data-driven organizations, is they're able to use this kind of connection to actually make decisions that have an impact on how an employee gets the work done and what tools they're using to get the work done. And to do that, you have to have a lot of different sort of examples of dashboards and ways to share that information. Murali, this is a great example, I think, from some of the work that you guys are doing. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen your customers actually integrate these kind of data sets in a way that is valuable for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, reporting and analytics is a big part of our software development effort here at Skillsoft, right? It's one of the most important areas for a lot of our major customers. In addition to the learning content itself, many of the things that we get asked is really built around data. So I think there has been, in recent times, a lot of knowledge and awareness on it, the importance of data. We gather a lot of data with respect to everything that happens in our platform, and try to build highly visual dashboards so that we are actually taking the data and translating that in actual business outcomes, right? So if we look at this dashboard here, the print is a little bit small, but towards the end, when someone creates like assignments, for example, and creates a learning campaign for their learners, we're trying to actually relate how that learning campaign correlates to an actual end business goal, right? Whether it is productivity or something else. We take we do a lot with respect to not only surfacing this data in our platforms, but we have very strong partnership with Harbinger and other companies in the HRMS space, where we're trying to take this data and actually get it into their talent management and learning systems as well, right? And in terms of building the solutions, I mean, we work very closely with our large customers. We have a design partner program where we're really looking at, okay, what are the enterprise needs, and involve and engage them in doing UX research and testing, so that we're able to build tools that really surface this. And we use design thinking methodologies like empathy mapping and personas to relating to the roles that we do, to understand the problem space. And our goal is to really deliver, greater success and impact the business of our customers.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment on the fact that, just having a dashboard or having a tool is helpful. But if it doesn't sort of connect with the end user, if you don't make a story out of it, or if you don't tie it to something that they're being held accountable to every day, it's just a number. So we took 20,000 courses. What does that mean, right? But if I took 20,000 courses and it's tied to, how many calls I made in a day, that becomes more real. So those are great examples. I love that. And Shrikant, he had mentioned that the work that he does with you guys, the Skillsoft team does with you guys, is really on connecting oftentimes to other HR technology environments. Can you talk a little bit about this idea of how that kind of connection happens, particularly since we have an HR audience that maybe doesn't actually work in the details of doing those kind of programming connections? Can you maybe share a little insight there?
Sure. I think so. When you learning these days, everybody was thinking like it's one or two systems, right? But that is not anymore. I mean, you have an LMS, LXP, authoring, various things that combine together to give you that whole learning experience. And what HR and employees want is, can this learning be enabled in the flow of work? And essentially our partnership with Skillsoft is in that direction. I mean, their vision about building the learning experience platform, but integration is kind of central to that, to enable data. So in the context of a CPO platform, Harbinger has collaborated to build point-to-point solutions between Percipio and SuccessFactors LMS to make the course catalog and tracking accessible to both systems. On the content side, where you discover content and you have multiple platforms from which you get the content, be it Percipio or Coursera. So we have built those integrations in such a way that this data and information is searchable and discoverable in both the systems, and everything happens from an integration standpoint. It's built in a scalable and an API friendly way, so this eventually helps on the scalability side. So when you look at it from a learner perspective or from an HR perspective, irrespective of where they're accessing this information, it is available because of this integration. It's available in the flow of their work. So that's what we are trying to accomplish with this integration, and of course, collaboration with Skillsoft and Percipio.
Yeah, no, I just actually had a question. Someone asked me about a certain couple of vendors, and I said, all the vendors are great, but check how, if you have data in one of the systems, it shows up in another system. That's exact the language I used, because so oftentimes these integrations are at the top layer. Like they make the same screens look the same, but if I can't get to my performance data that's in performance management in the same place where I'm actually having an employee profile, then they're not really integrated, right? And what you're talking about is what we call real integration, what we call process or flow-driven integration. And this kind of connection is what it takes, I think, to get the kind of data-driven organization outcomes that organizations are looking for. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to organizations and they're like, well, we have reports, but I have a report that comes out of this computer or this system and a report that comes out of this system, but they're not connected, right? And the other thing you guys had mentioned was how the approach to the employee or the approach to the end user, how important it is that their work is seamless. They're getting it where in the flow of work, right? And oftentimes I'm sort of asked, okay, well, it's great to be data driven. We're making good decisions for the company, but does that have an impact on the employee and what we're doing with the employee and the employee's processes they're going through? And that's still probably somewhat in research, but I can tell you from our data that we're definitely seeing that the two things are connected. Correlations are always hard to come by, but we can definitely see that as organizations invest more in data management and data governance and being data-driven organizations, we definitely see them focusing more and accomplishing out of their HR technology much more around the areas of employee engagement. Most organizations, when we're asked about what they actually get accomplished with their HRBI analytics processes, tools, and analytics, there's time that they spend on is mostly HR cost management, compliance issues, and then they sort of go down from there to employee engagement, employee retention, top talent, all good things, but as you can see, it's not as important as cost management and compliance. When we look at organizations who are data-driven, their number one focus of their HRBI analytics tools is employee engagement. That's where they spend their time. Sure, they're still doing cost management and compliance, but that's not where they're spending most of their time. They're also spending a lot of time on employee retention and productivity and optimal assignments and workforce readiness. Again, things that mean something to the employees and actually help them feel like the work that they're doing has an impact with the organization. These things are tightly connected, and organizations oftentimes forget that. And we definitely have seen this as we've gone through the last several months through the COVID-19 crisis management process that organizations have been going through. This here data that I'm going to start to share with you guys is preliminary data from this year's 2020 report. So what preliminary means is that the percentages might change slightly once we get through all of our cleaning process, but the things that are on top, we feel are going to stay on top. And what we found right now is when we asked organizations, what was the approach that you guys took? What's the top HR organizational responses to the COVID-19 crisis? What things did you have to do in your organization as the pandemic was sort of rolling through different regions and countries and markets? And what we found is that the number one thing organizations had to do at that point was redistribute critical workforces. Over 50%, and I'm assuming that number will jump once we start doing some cleaning, over 50% of them said, look, I did a lot of other things. I postponed work. I did some furloughs. I had to eliminate contract workers. I even increased tech spending because I moved people working from home. But the number one thing that I did was I redistributed critical workforces. So we were just talking about how important that it was to have data that could help you redistribute your workforce. We also asked organizations in our research, did you have the data you needed to actually do that? And what we found is that 50% of organizations felt they lacked critical HR data during their COVID-19 crisis response time. And this is really, think about 50% of organizations. Our data set's one of the largest data sets in the market. So one in every other organization, so yourself versus another, does not have the data it need to really manage things within their organization, as they were going through one of the scariest, most concerning times our countries have ever gone through, as far as how to manage workforces, ensure that people were comfortable, safe, and secure. And the number one thing that they were missing, 31% of organizations said, was employee skills, competencies, and licensing. That's amazing to me that that's the thing, but it doesn't surprise me. It's just really sad that after all the time and investment we've put into talent management systems and LMS systems, that we still feel like we don't have the data we need around employee skills, competencies, and licensing, or succession planning and career planning. So if I need to replace someone in my organization, if someone maybe is sick for a while, or someone needs to work from home and can't come into the office, who is the next person in line who's able to do that work? We don't have that data very accessible as well. Nor do we have easily accessible data on things like time to productivity. Those are the things you mentioned, Shrikant, with your organizations who are already starting to track some of that, or critical roles and positions in my organization. Like, which of the roles do I have to make sure that I ensure are sort of replaced or are maybe available in a frontline worker environment? This is the kind of thing that I think most organizations have been struggling with. So when everybody talks about HR being on the front lines, it's because these were the challenges that they were faced with. When we talked to organizations how they updated a lot of this data, it was manual processes. And ultimately, what we found is that if they had invested in a data-driven approach before the pandemic hit, those were the organizations who were not missing the data, who had up-to-date data. And I know, Murali, me and you had a lot of conversations about this, because skills and job roles are a big part of the work that you guys have done at Skillsoft to make sure that people kind of have a sense of who has the skills they need and what kind of skills might they need if we're going to maybe move them to a work from home environment, right? Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen your customers address the last several months and the pandemic approach they've taken for their own employees?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't seen such a bigger change than the past few months. The COVID-19 crisis has fundamentally changed how our customers view remote learning and talent management. For some customers, it was essential to learn effective use of new digital tools, as some of, just even simply using Zoom or some other digital tools. Yeah. For others, it was about developing better techniques for virtual team management, virtual collaboration. How do you function in this new environment? And how do you keep your team engaged, right? Yeah. So for others, it was about business continuity planning, right? Some of the things that you were talking about earlier, and there is a lot of learning that happens around that. And some of our customers were just looking to actually upskill and engage their employees as they were home. Some of these people were factory workers and people who were on the retail floor who are now at home, and gives a great opportunity for them to learn. Interestingly enough, for some of our larger customers, it also provided a positive disruption in the sense that they had a lot of notions around regulations and notions on things they can do, can't do in terms of data and sharing and learning. And all of those things got thrown out of the window by necessity, and they were able to roll out huge learning campaigns and dramatically adopt our platform over the past few months, right? We're also seeing a big shift in recent times in terms of digital transformation, so that the companies can more effectively actually compete in this new digital world, right? A lot of things are just happening digitally. So just to give a few numbers here, we wanted to share. I mean, we rolled out badging, where people get a badge when they complete some learning based on competency or skill. And we rolled this out in January, and after it really took off between, in the past 4 months where we released, we gave out 3.5 people earned 3.5 million badges.
Wow, right? That's a huge number. Yeah.
And a 300% plus increase in the learning content that is being accessed. So
Wow, those are just. I mean, I'm just sitting here imagining, because I know how big Skillsoft's audience is. You guys are one of the largest, really, sort of access to learners in the world, really, and 317% increase in learning content accessed in just the last few months, right? And 3.5 million badges. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you're sort of like. It wasn't just, although we were all feeling sort of scared and sort of trying to figure out what our next steps were, these organizations were taking a very quick step. Like you said, they learned that sometimes they could move very quickly and be very flexible in what their approach was. So really, really great data. And Shrikant, I know you're a business leader. I mean, you were at the head of your organization and dealing with the pandemic as well. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how, as a business leader, you saw this work inside your organization and the things that really helped your employees and leaders in the organization?
Sure. So one of the things that we did internally was to now we talk something that we did internally in the organization. So not that what we have implemented for our customers, but it could be something that they could do. So what I HR realized is today in this particular scenario, our employees need to be sent information in a manner which is very very in small nuggets, and they can take that on a need basis. So we had a nudging platform that we had built, and then we deployed it internally, and we used it to send out information both around motivating people as well as passing on the learning. And we also were able to integrate that with our success factors so that we could also do these nudges which are very specific to their work as well. So engineers get a different nudge, managers get a different nudge,
Oh, yeah.
HR people get a different nudge. So from that perspective, so that was one thing that we were able to do internally to change and adapt in this particular situation.
That's a great example. And just thinking myself about sort of like those first couple weeks when I work from home anyways, but the first couple weeks when everything was changing, just to get a little comment from your leader about, here's where we're at, here's what we're doing, like just be aware, right, would have been so helpful in an organization, I think, of any size. I mean, and I think that we've had a lot of conversation in the market and in the world as a whole right now about whether or not you want to be an agile organization or a flexible organization, or is that really the same thing? And there's been a lot of conversation about agile being something that we make a quick move, we pivot, we're gonna quickly move into a new business model or a new approach to learning. But what we found is that that's kind of scary for a lot of people. And oftentimes without the tools, the data, the insights, the tailoring, without the processes and guidelines that you need, right, then it just becomes very much like a quick movement in the organization. Where what a lot of organizations, I think, have found that if not so much more focused on agility as they are focused on flexibility, making sure that they have those things that they need to bend as an organization, seems to be the better outcomes that we're seeing organizations achieve. Agile is a component of it, but you have to be flexible, making sure that you can sort of give people what they need, when they need it, and where they need it. And data really as a tool isn't just overwhelming data, it's a pointer towards that flexibility. I mean, Murali, you've had a lot of conversations with me about how you have worked internally with your team and how being flexible works with being an agile organization. Can you talk a little bit about that for you?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about, it's amazing, right? So past few months, there's been such fundamental shifts in how we work and things we do. But, I think we were lucky to actually have a very strong agile practice here at Skillsoft, where we're able to continue the work without any impact, right? We look at a lot of data over the past, months in terms of how are we able to execute. And I can talk about this later, but if we look at ourselves and ask, what is an agile organization? Basically, these are organizations that are quick to respond to changes, right? But that said, quick doesn't mean that you're not responsible or flexible and respond to the needs of the customer in this unique environment, right? So we start with the basic model of Agile, where we use something called a scaled Agile framework, and we plan in these quarterly increments, program increments, right, where we're looking at an entire quarter and what we want to achieve for the whole year. But then we actually execute in very short intervals of time in 2-week sprints, where we're looking at any customer requirement or a feature or something and operating in these 2-week cycles where we develop thin pieces of these capabilities and deliver it to production, and then actually measure both quantitatively and qualitatively how it is making an impact. And based on that, we actually make decisions. Okay, do we build on this, or do we not build on this, leave this on the side, do we reinvest? And it's really about having that mindset of flexibility and not being able to, okay, we're doing this, now we have to build like a castle around this, right?
Yes, exactly. No, I love that, because like you said, the idea is that you have the data and you have the processes to do it, but first you have to make sure that you're sort of listening to your customers about what they really need, right? And I mean, I talked to a lot of engineers about this. They may have been building out important tool sets that had to do with sort of a growing economy. Well, as the economy started to shrink a little bit, maybe we had to rethink our model a bit, right? And that gives you the opportunity to do that with what you just talked about. So really great sort of insight into sort of how even our software had to change a little bit. And if you have the tools in place to do it, you can do it much more seamlessly. And that gets back to sort of where we started the conversation, which is to be flexible and to have an agile approach. Within that flexibility, organizations had to have started with a conversation about data governance. They had to know what data they had available. They had to understand the security and the privacy of that data, as you had mentioned, Shrikant. Like that was an important component of those nudges, is being able to tailor it to an employee so that they saw the things that were most important to them. We had to think a little bit about accessibility of that data. We've talked about how that plays into the role of engagement, and things like where that data flows from one system to another with the integration. All of these are important topics that a lot of time get sort of sidelined for the idea of, oh, let's just do better HR analytics, right? These things are what HR analytics is really all about. And when I talk about being a data-driven organization, it starts with data governance for most organizations who are doing it fundamentally well. The other thing we know is that data governance doesn't start with just whatever's in your HR system, right? A lot of times we think about data as the, organizations say, yes, I have data governance of what's in my HR environment. What we do know is that about just 12% of organizations have a plan or have an approach to identifying and aggregating an employee's total data footprint inside their organization. That's really, when I first asked this question, I was like, think about all the places you gather data that goes beyond just your HR system. And most organizations didn't want to think about that, or they didn't have approach to thinking about it, is a better way to put that. 42% of them didn't even know if they had a strategy at all for aggregating employee data. But our data-driven organizations may not be there any more than any other organizations, but they're on that path. They're 1.5 times more likely to be creating a process and approach to aggregating and identifying all the employee data, even if it's not going to be in the same systems, or even if by regulations it's not allowed to be in the same systems. But knowing where it's at gives them the option of sort of understanding how they use it. That, I think, gets back, Murali, to what you said, is that a lot of people thought there were regulations that were stopping them from doing things, right? But until they were able to actually sort of do it, and they realized, yeah, no, the regulations weren't as bad as they thought, and there was better ways maybe to think about it. They had to know they had the data, was the first question, right? When we ask organizations about, do you know all the ways your employee data is being captured in your organization, most of the times we find that organizations think just about their HR systems. But when we ask them about all the other ways, like social media or personal mobile devices or audio monitoring tools or environmental systems, most organizations sort of forget about all these different ways that they're leveraging data inside their organization. And that kind of how we gather data and what tools we're using to gather data then flips around to, I think, what you were just talking about, Shrikant, which is, if I'm going to nudge someone, what's the best way to reach them, right? 91% of organizations said that email was one of its most valuable COVID-19 crisis management tools. 91%. And there were other tools, Zoom, Microsoft, those are the same things, right, that people were using, Microsoft Teams. But when we look also at what tools organizations are using to communicate with their employees in general beyond COVID-19, what we find is email is the #1 tool that organizations are using. And Data-driven organizations are twice as likely to be using other types of tools like surveys, call centers, those type of things. And they're also twice as likely to be using more than one tool. So on average, they use about 4 different communication methods. Now, first of all, you have to know what data you have on employees, what data can be leveraged and how it can be used. And then you have to use that to tailor your data and basically turn that into something that's a tailored message for employees. And that's where we start to see the engagement really ramp up for employees. When you're communicating with me in a way that I want to be communicated, knowing all the data that I've already shared with you, you're only asking me about the things that you don't have at that point, and you're ensuring that the conversation is relevant to me right now when I'm in my most insecure moment where there's fear and pandemic and changes going on in the organization. That's when we saw those organizations who were able to leverage all of that come out with much better outcomes. You know, just sort of thinking a little bit about that as sort of our last item of conversation today, the idea of personalization, we also saw that organizations, 55% of organizations provided new training on top of everything else that they were doing. And some of them used existing LMSs, some of them used third-party content provider. But again, that idea of pushing content, information to an employee in a way that made them secure and feel safe had to do with that personalization conversation. Maybe just as a wrap up to the conversation, we've talked a lot about data and how it can help you make decisions and how it can connect to employee engagement, and then ultimately how really capturing your data and using it in a way to interact with an employee sort of in a tailored, personalized way can be the most valuable. Murali, you guys have done a lot of work at Skillsoft with this idea of personalization, particularly an AI-driven one where it's so you don't have to think as much about all those pieces, but they're actually brought together for you. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of thinking you guys have put into this and how much of an impact it's made? Oh, Murali, I think you're on mute. Let's make sure you're unmuted. There you go.
I am. Thank you. Thank you for that. So I was saying I'm going to keep this short. You know, I think we have some time for Q&A. But with respect to personalization, you know, we are really in a new era of personalization driven through AI. You know, our customers are expecting the same level of experience they see in their personal lives. When we started building Percipio, our view of this was that we build Percipio sort of as in a Netflix-like model where, you know, we get what we want based on what we need, right?
Yeah.
And with the same level of consumer grade influence. You know, our search or whether we're doing recommendations or telling you based on, you know, in Amazon, we see like the shopping behavior. So we suggest learning content to you based on, again, like, you know, how we are using a lot of AI models and algorithms. You know, I think the investment that we put there, I mean, just to share some metric, right? I think we have been validated over the past 4 years where if we look at our adoption of a new platform compared to our existing, some of our older learning platforms, we see people spending 4x more time learning content in the new platform, right? And we see more visitors and longer session times where they're actually consuming content. So we feel very validated in terms of the investment we put in relation to personalizing the platform.
Yeah, no, and that gets right back to where we started, where we were talking about why were people replacing these talent and learning systems. They weren't integrated, they didn't have the data, and they weren't being adopted, right? And I think what you're talking about is that getting adoption means you have, so really you have to start back with that data governance conversation to get to where an organization can actually leverage these tools really effectively. You guys have done a lot of work for them, but they got to do a little bit of work on their own too as well. So that's, I think, the if there's a message to come out of this, there's so much here about sort of what organizations can achieve if they start with the basics, right? We started off by saying you start with the beginning, and that really is to think about what does a data-driven organization's behaviors look like and how do I match those? And what kind of data governance should we be really thinking about? What are the things that I should be managing in my organization? And if I'm a flexible organization, how is that different from just being agile and making sure that I have the data to bend the direction I need to bend, right? And then if I'm going to be making decisions and sharing communications with my employees, really I should be doing that with all of their data, not just whatever's in their core HRMS or whatever's in their LMS or whatever's in their talent tools. And then I should be personalizing it, right? The flow of the conversation is much more about how the data can be used to get a better outcome for organizations and employees, and not just that data is sort of a good thing to have. It has to be used in a different way. So this has been a really good, I think, conversation that sort of mixed up some of the data that I had with some of the examples you guys have had. Maybe sort of as we sort of get into the questions, Seema, I know you've been monitoring questions for us. Are there any questions that Shrikant and Murali and I could maybe answer for the audience as we sort of wrap up the conversation today?
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you're able to hear me. Yes, okay.
Yep, you're doing
Thank
good.
you. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through the QA panel here. And Kumudini here, as you see on the screen, she's from our marketing division. She's going to help me look up the questions. So bear with me. There's a lot of good information you've already given. So let's see what questions we have. Let me open the panel. So I see one question, and Stacey, maybe you or maybe even Shrikant can answer. So the question says, I know that data-driven organizations are important, but how do we get started if our organization doesn't have a good approach to managing data today? Where do they start?
That's a really good question. And to be honest, I'm going to see if Shrikant and Murali, if you guys have a good answer to that. Shrikant, I'll start with you because I think this is a very practical question. How did your clients or even yourself, how did you guys think about being a data-driven organization at the start of the process, right?
As a process, I think it's important to understand the business outcome that you're looking from by collecting data, because when you're talking about data and AI using at the far end, you need to know, okay, I want to improve my costs, or I want to become more efficient in my processes. I want to drive certain business outcomes that as a company, it'll drive my bottom line or revenue goals. So once you have that in place, then you know which systems you need to go and collect data from. And then you build that, either you buy that system if it's readily available, that's the best way to go for organizations. But in most cases, it's about this thing existing in 4 or 5 or 6 different systems. Yeah. So bringing that information together, connecting those systems together and integrating so that those systems produce better results for you on the analytics side, or build your own data warehouse and do your analytics if it's very, very custom to your business workflow. So that's how you start, but you start with one outcome and then, increase it as you get success. That's
really, and one of the fastest growing things that organizations are purchasing right now based off of our data from last year is data warehouses and data lake investments, which I think it goes right along with what you're talking about, that integration conversation. Murali, I know you had talked a little bit at some point about sort of how your organization has actually made some of these changes itself. Are you able to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I think it first starts with the executive leadership realizing the importance of data, right? And having leadership at the highest level who across the company is able to build a vision and set up all the right model so that you actually can become a data-driven organization. So here at Skillsoft, I think about a year back, we actually hired a very high-level leader reporting to the topmost person in the company, whose mission with looking at data across all organizations, whether it is building new product features, or it's sales or marketing or finance, and working with IT to build all these things together, right? Some of the metrics actually that I was able to share, and then we can share more, is actually directly coming from some of the work that is happening there.
Yeah. it makes it, you can get the numbers you need, right? Love that. And that's, so even if your leadership isn't talking there yet, it sounds like, sharing with them stories like what you just shared, which is, this is how it happened. You have to have it at the top is really important. Those are great feedback. Seema,
Very
any
good.
other questions?
Excellent.
I mean, I think,
yes,
yeah.
there are a couple of questions, and I don't think we may not be able to answer all of them, but we'll definitely follow up with a Q&A and share it with all the attendees. So there's a question where it says, how much should corporate leaders rely on benchmarking against their peers for their future learning strategy?
That's actually a really good question. I mean, Shrikant, do you work with a lot of customers who do benchmarking and that helps them? Can you maybe talk a little bit about that for any of your customers' perspectives?
I think maybe Murali can take that question because they may be benchmarking across customers and they may have more accurate data. So, Murali, is it okay if I pass it on to you?
Sure, I'll tell you that's a tough one. My view is that there certainly has to be a lot more benchmarking that needs to happen in the learning industry, just not in terms of data, but in terms of even evolving standards. I think technologically, the learning and HR area of technology, and I've been in other technology spaces, so there really needs to be a lot more adoption of technology so that we're able to share and do this level of benchmarking.
Thank you. Thank you, Murali. And I think we have one last question. We are right at the hour. So let's take a last question here I have, and maybe if the answer is too long, we'll have to write the answer later on as a follow-up. So Suchi says here that often people analytics is at intersection of thought leadership between HR and technology and data driven by AI. AI can be only utilized well when audience and process is understood. In your experience, how many times HR have buy-in from C-suite to sign up for tools during budget constraints?
Oh, the ultimate question, yeah.
Yeah, if you want me to read it again, I may. But it's a good question. Very excellent.
I think what she's saying is that AI requires a lot of investment in time and energy, right, and training, and then how do you what do you do to ensure the C-suite's going to invest that kind of investment in it, right, during difficult times? Is that a good way of bringing that back, Seema?
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe, either of you guys have, this is a great question. We're in the midst of a pandemic and an economic downturn, and is this the time to invest in AI? I think my answer is it's the time to invest in the processes you need, right? You need to have those processes in place and clean data to make sure that AI actually is going to help you going forward. But, Murali and Shrikant, in the work that you guys are doing, do you think that you're going to invest more or less with where everything's at right now?
Very quickly, maybe I can go. And what I remember in your slide, you said that 50% of the organizations didn't have enough data to react to the COVID situation.
Exactly.
So I think that was an interesting perspective. So if we don't invest, then in situations like this, we may not be able to respond better than other organizations. But it also has to have an element of how much we can afford. So so it's a balancing act, and I'm sure the C-suite and the HR can figure it out. Yeah.
So just a small point that I want to add there is, at least based on my experience, what I've seen, and this differs from company to company based on their size, is, HR, it all is based on relationships and reaching out across the aisle and building partnerships. So in our company here, what I've seen is, when HR and engineering or a technology arm sort of get together, I think a lot of good things can happen, right? Because, there may be some AI happening there in an area which you can leverage just through partnerships, right? Because some of this, it's technologically just HR by themselves, may not have the resources or funding to deliver, but with partnerships that could be done. And the other thing I will mention is that companies like Amazon, AWS, and Google have really commoditized the AI and machine learning tools and strategies available out there, which can be really leveraged to achieve a lot more than we were able to in the past.
That's great feedback. That's a good point, that it may not be as expensive as you think, right? It might be, like you said, just, I always tell people, take a finance and IT person out to lunch if you're in HR. They need the time, you will get a lot of insight, and it'll be a great opportunity. So we'll leave it on that, Seema. That's our advice.
Okay.
Take someone
Thank
from
you.
IT and HR and finance out to lunch today
Thank you.
or virtually.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think we can have the thank you slide. Thank you. I think we can, we're almost over 4 minutes over time. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Really appreciate all the speakers giving us a lot of information, a lot of thinking to do, and a lot of future planning to do. Please write to us. I'm Seema at harbingergroup.com, or you can write to Shrikant. You can also write to Stacey. Stacey has links that we're going to share with you for downloading the survey report on the survey.
Exactly.
And feel free to write to Murali also. As you know, he has a lot to share. And thank you very much. You all have a safe summer.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.